I want to encourage you to come these next 3 weeks, because at the end of this series, I'm going to show you what this video was all about. I saw it, and I thought it was very poignant. I thought it was very important for the series and what we're about to learn. We're talking about first fruits. That's our new series, and we're talking about what Jesus loved to talk about, and he loved talking about this subject a lot. So if he talked about it, I truly believe that we should be loving and ready to hear what he loved to talk about. Does anybody know what Jesus loved talking about? And if this is your first time with us here at Area 316, I love being interactive, so don't worry. You can just shout it out. What did Jesus love talking about? Anyone? That means you were here first, sir. Way to ruin it for everybody. What Jesus loved talking about was giving and money. Believe it or not. Did you know this? That giving and money is talked about in the Bible 2,161 times. Second to that is love at 714 times. And third to that is praying at 371 times. How amazing is that? I don't know about you, but for me, growing up, I was always taught this way. You have to give. You have to give. It was pounded into me. You have to give. If you don't give, you can't go to heaven. There's no way Jesus is going to love you if you don't give. Anybody else have that problem when you were younger going through church and everything? And that really turned me off, right? We're talking about money, and everybody's first instinct is this. Your brain turns off. Your second one is this. Here he goes again. All they want to do is talk about money. Yeah, I better give to the church. Or people run to the door. So, Nicholas, go stand at the door. That way no one leaves. But hopefully that you find today that we start changing the way we think about giving. I remember growing up as a Baptist because that was the only bus that went through my neighborhood that wasn't shot at, right? They would take us to church and they would pound it. You better give. You better give. You better give. And then when my mom converted over to Catholicism and she wanted to go back to her faith, I followed along with her. And I was taught through all those classes, you have to give, you have to give, you have to give, you have to give. And it was pounded into my head. So every time I went to church, and the first thing they talked about was what? Money. I was like, oh, here we go again. And so that turns us off to what Jesus loved talking about. And things like this happen. I don't know about you guys, but the other day on TBN, I saw this commercial, and it was crazy because it was like, you need to order miracle water. Yes, order miracle water, drink the miracle water, and you would be highly blessed. And then they showed this lady who ordered the miracle water, and she drank it, and she said, oh, I drank the water, and let me tell you, 3 days later, I got a check for $10,000. And I was on my phone like, let me call right now, because I want this miracle water. And it was crazy because they were like, we want to give you this miracle water. It's yours absolutely free. For a one-time donation of $29.99, you can receive the miracle water. 1-800 what? And so we see this, and people buy into this, right? They'll order the miracle water, and they'll drink it. 3 days later, what do they get? Nothing. Maybe a bill for the miracle water they just ordered, right? And so a lot of people, they get upset. They grow leery of giving. So what I hope happens through these 3 weeks is that we start changing the way we think about giving, that we break our old habits of turning off or wanting to just leave, and we start looking at giving at a totally different way. In fact, our bottom line is a reflection of that change of thinking, because if we stop and we think about the way we used to think about giving, how we were told we have to give, and we start thinking about giving as a relationship with God, and that we don't have to give anymore, that we get to give, then that truly changes the way we think about giving. So our bottom line for us today is this. Giving God your best is a reflection of your relationship with Him. Giving God your best is a reflection of the relationship you have with Him. And I love that because God, if you notice this, God always gives us the very best. He doesn't ever give us the very least. He gives us the very best. And when we know that, and we have that relationship with God, and we change the way we think about giving, that we don't have to anymore, that we get to give, and we start doing that out of that relationship, then things change. And the way people start seeing you, they start to change the way they think about God and the way they think about giving. And since the beginning of time, God has given us the very best. Think about this. In the beginning of time, God created the heavens and the earth for you and I. He created this beautiful galaxy. He created the earth so we can be in it. All these amazing things. And then God created the Garden of Eden, a beautiful garden for you and for me. He put Adam and Eve in the middle of this garden. He says, guess what? All of this is for you. Take what you want from this garden, have what you want, but, because with God, there's always that one but, right? You can't have anything from this certain tree. Everything else, everything you want, you need, is yours, except from this tree. And so what did Adam and Eve do? They said, well, that's awesome, but I'm going to take from this tree. They disobeyed God. I mean, they had everything. What were you thinking? Because that's going to be my first question when I get to go to heaven and I get to meet Adam, is what were you thinking, buddy? What were you thinking? You had everything, yet you wanted something from this tree. So God removed Adam and Eve from the garden. And so Adam and Eve had children. They had Abel and Cain. So if you would you please open up your Bibles to the book of Genesis? We're going to be in chapter 4. We're going to be in verse 2 through 5. So if you don't have a Bible, no worries. You should have an outline with you. Faith, can you raise the lights just a little bit for people so they can write? Perfect. You're awesome. Thank you so much. If you don't have an outline, Scripture is going to be on the screen for you. If you don't have an outline, you don't have a Bible, you've been wanting your own Bible, just see us after service, and we love to give you your very own Bible. So this part of the story where we're going to learn about about Abel and Cain fits our bottom line, where we said giving God your best is a reflection of your relationship with Him. And we read Genesis 4, 2 through 5. It says this: when they grew up, Abel became a shepherd, while Cain cultivated the ground. So we know Abel's a shepherd, Cain is a farmer. When it was time for the harvest, Cain presented some of his crops as a gift to the Lord. Abel also brought a gift, the best portions of the firstborn lamb of his flock. The Lord accepted Abel's gifts and his gift, but he did not accept Cain and his gifts. This made Cain very angry, and he looked dejected. Did you catch that? Did you catch that Cain came with some of his portion, some of his harvest to God? And you may be sitting there going, well, at least he came with some, Pastor Juan. But when we read it, we see that Abel came with the very best, with the firstborn of the flock. And he brought it to God. And so what are the first fruits? This is what the first fruits are. The first fruits are this: the first portion of the harvest, which is given to God, the first to come in time, a pledge or a hope of the greater harvest to follow, and especially a dedication to God. Our first fruits right now are our tithes and our offerings to God. That's where we get our wages from working. And if you don't know what the tithe and what offerings are, and you're thinking, well, what's the difference between each one? It's this: the tithe is the 1%, the 1/10 of annual product of earning. That's your 10% from your earnings. And your offerings are the gifts brought to God beyond our tithes. And now, if you're sitting there and you're going, whoa, tacarese, Pastor Juan, tithing, sir, that's Old Testament. And we're under the new covenant with Jesus. And I would tell you this: you're absolutely correct. And so if we're going to talk about the new covenant of Jesus, and we're going to be in the covenant of Jesus, and we're going to do as Jesus tells us, then we need to know how to give in the new covenant. And it's this way, and we read it in the first book of Acts 2:45. What did they do? They sold all their possessions, and they gave all to everyone who had need. How's that 10% sound now? Sound pretty good, doesn't it? I'm just saying. But can I just point this out also? That before the 10% became even law in the Old Testament, we read about it in Genesis 14:20, what Abram did. We read this, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hands. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Abram, before this even became law, gave a tenth to God as a sacrifice, as an act. And in fact, it brings us into our first point today. It's this: your first fruits are an act of worship. Your first fruits are an act of worship. Proverbs 3:9-10 says this: honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruit of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will be brim over with new wine. And here's the thing, we need to know about our worship, because we all think, well, worship is just what we finished doing. And you guys sounded amazing. You guys sounded like one voice. I felt like I was actually in heaven. But worship is this. Worship is not just singing, but something you live and do. Worship is just not singing, but something you live and you do. Romans 12:1 says this: therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Your first fruits are your sacrifice and your worship to God and for the things that He's given you and I. And listen, this is what you need to know. Worship is placing your worth in something. Worship is placing your worth in something. So where do you place your worth in? Or better yet, the question should be this: who do you place your worth in? And if you place your worth in God, then it brings us to our second point, and it's this: your first fruits are an overflow of your relationship with God. Your first fruits are an overflow of your relationship with God. If you ever come and visit me and you sit in my office and we talk and you're telling me what's happening in your life, I want you to be prepared, because this is going to be the first question I will ask you. And this first question is this: how is your relationship with God? Where is your relationship with God? You see, your first fruits are an overflow of that relationship with God. And guess what? And if you have a great relationship with God and it's an overflow, your first fruits, and you always bring it to Him, guess what? People will see that. And listen, I need you to know this, because I want to be transparent with you. Our leadership wants to be transparent with you. I want to let you know that me and your leadership, we believe in the 10%. We give the tithe. That's our overflow of a relationship with Jesus. And that's where we place our worth and our value is in Him. And so it becomes, where do you place your worth and your value? Where's your relationship with Jesus? Because Jesus is truly going to lead you in how to give, when to give, and how much to give. Because we've said this from the beginning, and we truly believe this, that what you give is truly between you and God. 2 Corinthians 9:7 says this: you must each decide in your own heart how much to give. And I love this part, and people forget this part because they actually go to the end where it says, for God loves a person who gives cheerfully. They don't want to read this part because it kind of hurts. Because it says this: and don't give reluctantly or in a response to pressure. Don't give reluctantly or response to pressure. That's why I'm telling you, let's change our way of thinking of we have to. That's that pressure that God is talking about to us. And He's saying, no. Don't give that way. Give that the way of, oh, I get to give. You see, because you have to say that to yourself. I have to give. It kind of cringe, don't you? But say it this way: I get to give. My God so loved me that He's given me these things that I get to give. you can actually feel the difference in those ways. So listen, God knew this was going to be a problem, that this was going to be a battle between him and money for your heart. And here's what you need to know, because I've said this a lot of times, especially when I was coming into my faith. I was arguing with somebody, and he was like, you have to. And I told him, hey, what does God truly want? Does he want my money or does he want my heart? Because he can only have one or the other. And we need to know this, that God doesn't want your money. God doesn't want your money. What he wants is your heart. That's what it's all about. When you start having this struggle of giving or do I have to, it's a struggle of the heart. It becomes a heart issue. How is your relationship with Jesus Christ? Do you have that relationship with Jesus Christ? Because when you have that relationship, it's no longer a heart issue. It's no longer a struggle because you get to. It's no longer have to, but you get to. Listen, we need to remember this. 1 Chronicles 29:11 says this. Yours, Lord, is the greatest and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor, for everything in heaven and earth is yours. Yours, Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. What that says helps us change the way we think. If we stop thinking that everything is ours and start believing in that everything is God's. God created the heavens and the earth. He created all this splendor for you and for I. We don't own any of this. It's all God's. That helps us change the way of why we give. That helps change that mentality of have to. And when we know none of this is ours and God blesses you every single day with everything you have, then we realize we start changing the way we think, and that relationship with him becomes even closer. And when we think about everything that he's done for us and everything he's given us, it's never some like Cain did. It's always the best. It's always more than we deserve. Then we truly start changing the way we think about our relationship with God, and we start changing the way we think about giving. And listen, I know this may sound like a guilt trip, like I'm trying to guilt you into something. And believe me, I am not. I'm just trying to help us change the way we think about a relationship with God and having faith in him. And that brings us to our last point, because they kind of go hand in hand, having faith in that relationship with God. And it's this: giving your first fruit shows God your faith in trusting him. Giving your first fruit shows God your faith in trusting him. Hebrews 11:4 says this: it was by faith that Abel brought a more acceptable offering to God than Cain did. Abel's offering gave evidence that he was a righteous man, and God showed his approval of his gifts. Although Abel was long dead, he still speaks to us by his example of faith. What that tells us is this: your faith moves the heart of God. Your faith moves the heart of God. Malachi 3:10 says this: bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this. This is the only time you'll read in the Bible where God says, test me in this. Test me. Watch what I can do. When you bring me the tithe into my house, watch what I do with that. Come on. I dare you to test me. Come on. Because you know what? I tried this one time. I want to let you know there's no way you can outgive God. There's just no way. And it keeps on going and says this, the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. Who wouldn't want those blessings coming down from heaven? You see, God says, you give me your very best, and I'm going to give you the very best in everything we do. And when you bring your first fruits to God, that shows your faith. And we need to know this, that your faith is stronger than your finances. Faith is stronger than finances. Now, I know I've been talking about this and talking about giving, and I understand this also, that there's a lot of people who won't be able to give. Some people are sitting there going, I wish I had stuff to give, Pastor Juan. I wish I could give out, but I just don't have anything. But here's the thing. You don't have to have money to give, because you can give of yourself in service. Yeah, we're called to take charge of His church, to take care of His church. But if we're not able to give, He's called us to serve in His church. You see, it's not just about money. It's about your heart. And are you ready to change the way you think about your relationship with God? Are you ready to change the way you think about giving to God? Because it's not monetary value, just that. It's also serving in His church. He calls us to serve and to give. It works both ways. Listen, I love this book, and you've heard me say it from time and time and time again, how this book is an amazing love story between you and God. But what's even more amazing is when you start reading this book and something stands out to you. It's just not a story about giving, about love. It's a story about giving and how much He gives to us. He always gives His very best. How do we know this? Simple. John 3:16. We all know it, right? For God so loved the world. He didn't just love it. He so loved the world that He gave what? His one and only Son. He gave His first fruit to us. His firstborn to us. The very best. The Lamb led to a slaughter on the cross for you and I. The very best is always given by God to us. And if we start changing the way we think about our relationship with Him, and start changing the way we think about giving to Him, we know that we can give and we can serve. How do we know this? Mark 10:45 says this, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to what? Serve. Don't be scared of that word. But to serve. And to what? He served and He gives His life as a ransom for many. God always gives His very best to us. So that leads us to know that if He gives us His very best, why shouldn't we always give the very best back to God? Start changing the way we think about our relationship with God, knowing that when we give to God, it's an act of worship. It's an act of sacrifice. It's that faith we have in God, saying, God, this is all I have, but I bring it to you gladly and cheerfully, knowing that you'll accept it. Not that I have to, but I get to give as an act of worship. And when we start changing the way we think about that, our first fruits begin to multiply. Then we realize this, at the core of all this, that Christ becomes enough for us. That Christ is all we need. That when He came to the cross, no matter in the middle of our mess, in the middle of what we're doing now, and all our craziness, of our cray-cray stuff happening in our lives, that God said, I'm still going to give you the very best. Even though you turned your back on me, I'm still going to give you the very best. Even though you took the lamb that I gave you, you took Him to the cross, you took 3 nails, His body broken, His blood spilt on it, I'm still going to give you the very best. And when we start thinking that way, we see our relationship with God change. And not just break the old habits and the old change that brought us down. And when we hear the word money or giving at a church, we become so overjoyed that we get to. That in the midst of all this, that God gave us the very best. And that we know that we can bring our first fruits to Him. And in the efforts to try to outgive God, he opens up the floodgates of heaven. Not just the little bitty gate, the floodgates of heaven for you and for I. So it's time to start changing the way we think, embracing the very best that God gives us, giving it right back to him, and making our relationship with God that much closer, that much personal. That way, when it's time to give, you know you're giving out of a cheerful heart. Let's pray.